Howie, we're here again. Welcome to Health and Veritas. I'm Harlan Krumholtz.
Yep, and I'm Howie Form. We're physicians and professors at Yale University, and we're trying to get closer to the truth about health and healthcare. This is one of our periodic episodes without a guest. And again, there's a lot of news to update each other about and our listeners. But I want to first start off by just mentioning we're taping this earlier in the week. Tomorrow is Election Day. We are not going to talk about the election or politics today, but we know that a lot will happen between now and when this episode drops. So just not to think that we're ignoring.
Well, we did this on Monday. The markets are hot on this. You're not going to make a prediction?
Not going to make any predictions at all.
Okay, because we don't want to be wrong.
Don't want to be wrong. Just want to talk about health and healthcare.
We talked a little bit about politics last time.
No, we did.
And we got a little feedback.
And it's important, I think, to talk about things that really are health and healthcare related, whether they are politics or not. But today there's a lot of topics we could talk about. And in fact, my whole array of things I want to talk about is just infectious diseases. But
I know. So then those are scary topics. I don't know why you go there.
Yeah, no, but they're scary, but they're also good. There's good news there also, if you want to start off with the good news.
Oh, you know what? Let's start with you and the good news. I always like to start with good news.
So about, I don't know, it was a year or 2 years ago, you talked about Norovirus, and you reminded us.
I told you that's one of my least favorite viruses.
Yeah, exactly. It's the diarrhea.
Well, there's
vomiting.
no favorite virus, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. But it's a really bad one, and it's one that spreads so easily. And quite frankly, look, 700 million infections a year, 200,000 deaths annually. So it's not inconsequential, even aside from the discomfort that everybody else feels.
It's why I won't go on a cruise.
I understand.
Well, besides the fact I get seasick.
I understand that. But it's half of all foodborne outbreaks also. So, it's not inconsequential. And the good news is that about
And what happens when you get norovirus?
You get bad vomiting, you get diarrhea, and you are almost certainly going to spread it to anybody near you.
It's one of the most infectious viruses.
It's ridiculous. I mean, they've done mapping of this where literally somebody vomited in a restaurant, and they showed the frequency of likelihood of getting norovirus was if you were one table away, you had this frequency.
Oh my God!
I mean, just absurd.
That would just be
So anyway. We don't want to discuss.
Note to self: if someone's vomiting next to you in the restaurant, move away.
But here's the good news. The good news is that about a month ago, a paper was published that demonstrated the feasibility of a bivalent vaccine that is in development, and it seems to work in animal models. And it's now beginning human trials. 25,000 individuals will enter a human clinical trial. I think it's over something like 6 countries.
And is the idea that it'll prevent it? We've got this flu vaccine that we know can mitigate it, but still lots of people get flu. Is this one of these things that can actually protect us?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but I would imagine that it would reduce the spread if it's effective. But that's what we thought was going to happen with COVID as well. And while it did a little bit, not a lot. So we'll wait and see. But it's nice to see we're making progress on something that, while it's not a catastrophic illness that is going to kill people, it is definitely something that is devastating. I mean, I shouldn't say it's not catastrophic. 200,000 people die a year, but tiny fractions.
What?
No, but tiny fraction of the 700 million infections. So
200,000 people die of norovirus a year?
Over the world, across the world.
Wow, but it's
like a lot.
That's a big number.
But for the most part, it's a self-limiting disease.
I just wonder if we're going to have to change our mindset about these vaccines. I mean, I know there are lots of vaccines in development around a wide variety of illnesses. Even I was hearing today that Shingrix, which, highly recommended virus to prevent shingles, which can be a terrible thing to get, also cause blindness, can cause a whole range of things. Even people who get the Shingrix vaccine, you have to get 2 shots. About half of the people don't show up for the second shot. You? Howie?
I know.
What?
I know.
What?
I know. I'm not going to go and tell our listeners the whole story, but I went for the first shot.
Oh my gosh.
It was extremely reactogenicity for me, a lot of bad reactions. And then
what was the bad reaction?
Just a typical bad reactogenicity.
Okay.
But then when I would have gotten the next shot is when I had a major medical problem.
Okay.
And
then you just haven't gotten back to it. All right. Any other good news you had?
No, well, I mean, I think a lot of the stuff to talk about is good news in a sense. I mean, we can go through them, but I'll let you go first, and then I have some other things that are
You have a lot of other things?
Well, I think they all have a layer of good news.
I told you I wanted to talk about this article that was in the Wall Street Journal that was really juxtaposing generationally doctors, and saying that there's a whole generation of doctors, of which we're a part of.
Yep.
That really saw this as a calling. I mean, you were going to wear a beeper, you were going to get woken up at night, you were going to have your life disrupted, and this is really what your calling was. And then there's a whole bunch of people who are younger who have different expectations. Now, I will say it was this calling versus a job kind of dichotomy. And I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's fair. I think a lot of people coming up these days are, in fact, thinking of it as a calling, but they, again, have very different expectations. And the interesting thing about this article is it was in talking with an older doctor. I don't even know how to describe it. Someone who's because this is our age, right? I guess it is just older, maybe, right? Someone maybe in their 60s or 50s. That there's a bit of a frustration with the younger doctors. And as they sort of opt for roles that allow them more flexibility, and many people think there's a shift is away from, being properly trained and being properly committed. We hear this even with the hours thing that people have forever said back in the day when I was training, when I was doing
things. It's always changing. Medicine has changed a lot.
Well, and this, by the way, it's not, I think, resonant with consistent attitudes and families where you can have two very busy, high-powered people. I mean, people need to have expectations of when they're not responsible for work versus when they are responsible for work. This idea of work-life balance, I heard a very interesting story about it the other day with regard to doctors. It's like sometimes there's this sort of job shaming where like people do really are into their jobs and want to spend a lot of time on them. They want to figure out how they can balance other responsibilities and have a full life, but they sort of get shamed because you're supposed to be embracing a work-life balance. So, there's a lot of things I think going on in medicine sociologically, both generationally, but also people trying to figure out what are these roles in the next generation. And I would say, a lot of the next generation do have different expectations of what. It's not that they don't want to work hard, but they may want to have that flexibility and know when they're on and when they're not.
Yeah, two thoughts I had from reading that article, and I was so glad when you said you were going to do it because rarely do I read the long articles in the Wall Street Journal, but this one I did. Two thoughts. One is that, number one, there is a sense when you're extremely well trained, when you've reached the point where you have so much to offer from your training, that you do want to give that back. And that is a sense of what I think of as a calling. Like, in other words, you're trained for it. You can make a contribution to society. There is a limited number of people like you that can actually do it. And so it makes you feel like I've just got to give as much as I can give. The flip side of that is that there are a lot of people out there who really, I don't even know if it's just work-life balance, but just see the job. It's a job. It pays well. I do it. It's a job, but I do it as much as I need to do it to sustain the lifestyle I want to have, but I don't have to do it any more than that. And if you talk to people, and it's not just medicine, by the way, I mean, the article's obviously about medicine, but I have friends here at the School of Management. I'm sure you have friends in other professions around who also are what used to be called workaholics. But if you ask them why they're doing it, it's like, I've got all this creative energy, I have all this ability, I can do so much, and I'm only here on this earth for a limited amount of time. And yes, I've made my children a priority, but at the same time, I don't mind doing this because it brings me joy. And I think there is a change culturally. Your point about shaming is absolutely true. I think the younger generation almost take pride in putting up the Heisman, like, I don't need to do any more than I want to do.
Yeah. I think there's a couple things that strike me. One is we have to take some responsibility for this in medicine, for how the work environment is these days. I mean, it sort of pushes you more in that direction. If your work is highly clerical, if there's less time with patients, if there's less opportunity to be using the skills you developed in medical school, but you're really doing a lot less than what was necessary for your training, I think that also drives people to say, I want to circumscribe the amount of time I spend. The more that we can create environments that energize people, let them feel that they're making a difference in other people's lives, give them the opportunity to invest in their patients and to make, that kind of contribution. I think the more people will gravitate in that direction. It is also important that we recognize there are some people who in that situation will necessarily want to spend as much time as they can doing that work. There will be other people who always will be saying, I'm glad to contribute, but I want to contribute within certain bounds. And we need in the profession to be able to accommodate both.
I do worry, though, that this article begins to explain why the physician shortage is not going to get better sooner, despite the fact that we've now spent 2 weeks in a row talking about why there is a physician shortage and how we might solve it and how AI might solve the physician shortage. It does worry me that if this is the trend, if retiring physicians who used to work 60 to 80-hour weeks are being replaced by physicians who really are working 35 to 40-hour weeks, we've got a problem.
It may exacerbate. I think technology may help. Let me just raise one other point here at the end, which is if we really want women and mothers in the profession, right now we are not a very friendly profession for allowing the kind of flexibility that parents need. I'll include fathers, but let's be honest, mothers often are carrying more of that responsibility. Their headspace is filled with, how they're juggling. And we need to work hard on figuring out that's not a sign of weakness. That's not people who aren't invested in the calling, but they're people who need to, the profession needs to say, how do we build this properly so people can make the investment, but still fill other roles.
And it's another big factor because if you go back 50 years, women were a small minority of physicians. And if you look now, women are a slight majority in parts of the country of new physicians. So we do need to actually think
about families
this.
Where you've got two doctors or two people pursuing high-powered careers. I mean, this just takes accommodation to be able to figure out how to make it work. Okay, go ahead. You're next.
All right, more good news. A little less on the good, but H5N1, we've talked about it a lot. I have been following this a lot.
Yeah, you scared the bejesus.
I'm still not calmed about it, but the good news is that not a lot has changed, but I'll still give you some really big updates. So the top line numbers have changed. There's now 41 human cases, almost equally split between cattle and poultry exposure. And then there's this one case in Missouri. And I was literally in Missouri when the news broke about the Missouri case, so I've paid probably more attention than
you go
most.
Back to Wash U?
I did. Yeah. I was literally there on that day.
That's your place, right?
That's my place, Wash U in St. Louis, Mallinckrodt. But the good news about the Missouri case is that at the beginning it was, one woman who they couldn't figure out how she got it, so they worried that it was human spread. And then 5 people taking care of her in the hospital came down with flu-like symptoms. And then her roommate or somebody who she's living with also came down with symptoms. So this starts to get a little worrisome. The CDC, it took them about 7 weeks. CDC did a very thorough investigation. And what they discovered were none of the people in the hospital tested positive for H5N1 by serology, and none of them got tested positive by nasal swabs. The housemate tested positive by serology on, I think, 1 of 3 tests. So they're not even certain it's a true positive. But even if it's a true positive, they believe that the exposure was probably a common exposure, like both of them were out kissing pigs. I don't know. We'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
But like we've talked about before, I mean, it's possible getting close to poultry without realizing it. So that's really good news, because I will tell you, if you were in the sort of the muck of people talking about this, the concern about the Missouri case was.
You mean on social media?
Social media, but also on Stat News. Helen Branswell, who has been covering this fantastically, they were getting a lot of concern about it. One more thing that also has come out in the last few weeks is that a pig tested positive for H5N1. Now, this is different than what we talked about in Minnesota a few weeks ago, where it was an H5N1V, which is a variant, different thing. This was this bird flu in a pig, which apparently is
So you're saying it jumped species?
That's the concern. And pig apparently is closer to human than cows, or at least that. So this was a big concern. But let me also give you good news on this one. Our friend, colleague, Michael Osterholm at University of Minnesota.
Yeah, he knows a lot about this.
He knows a lot about this stuff. He has come back and said, yes, there's a pig, a backyard pig, by the way, in Oregon. That's the one that got tested positive. But he is not sure that it's anything more than nasal swab that they got. And if it's nasal swab...
I usually call that a snout swab.
I'm sure you do. Yes, because you are the swinologist or whatever it is among us. But the point being that it may be contamination and not that the pig was systemically infected. So they're doing an autopsy.
So we should be reassured. For the moment, we can be reassured by this.
All of this gets right back to what you said a long time ago, which is we're not worried because there's still nothing that says human-to-human transmission.
Great. Okay, that's good news.
Give me something else.
All right, back to me. Look, hey, I was just thinking, I wanted to get back to one more thing about that Wall Street Journal article. I am so impressed. Our Department of Internal Medicine, run by our friend Mark Siegel, and also a large group of individuals. I will say that at Yale, there is a specific focus on how to create this sort of flexibility and to understand, how to bridge this gap. And anyway, I just want to give a shout out to them too, because I know this is top of mind for them.
No, it's true. I mean, look, they are a humanist-driven program. They care about people just across the board.
I think they've done a great job figuring out how to ensure that people are trained really, really well, but that the program itself is humane.
Yep.
All right, so I wanted to come back to you. You've heard me talk about this from time to time, this issue about whether or not corporate America could take over primary care. And the issue is that we know that there's a primary care shortage. My gosh, even in New Haven with the density of docs we have, it's almost impossible to get primary care doctor. My mother-in-law moved to Boston from Providence, and she was just by luck able to get it. There was like an opening where they said, we're taking new patients. It lasted about 15 minutes, and then they closed off and they're no longer taking new patients. She got in, but it was going to be heck to try to figure out how to get a primary care. So as you remember, between Minute Clinics and then these Oak Street and Iora, and there were all these new approaches to try to figure out how to handle primary care, bring in technology, make this focus on the patient, do all these different things. And then they started getting bought. Amazon bought One Medical and Walgreens bought Village MD, and there were all of these different kinds of things. These things started to go skyrocketing valuations.
And we can come back to this, but just to point out for our listeners, most of them are different models. Like some of them are targeted at sicker than average Medicare Advantage patients. Some of them are targeting the retail, low cost in the store type. And then there's One Medical, which is really targeting richer people who are willing to pay more.
Who took Iora, didn't the One Medical?
I forget which one is which now.
There's so many of them.
Yeah.
So, but you remember we talked on the show about how Walmart had they had built bricks and mortar. They had this whole thing all planned out, and then they withdrew from the market. Well, anyway, the thing I wanted to bring up today was Cigna, which had a $2.7 billion investment in Village MD, and had already written off it's like 700 or 900 million of it. Decided to take it to zero. In their last earnings call, they said, we're writing this off.
Worthless.
Completely. Right. I mean, Howie, you're the business guy. What does it mean when a company says, we've made a $2.7 billion investment and now on our books, we're going to value it at zero?
It means they made a huge, huge mistake. And by the way, I just checked, you're correct. Iora, One Medical is a one.
So this is fascinating. I mean, there was a lot of talk about Walgreens also because they co-invested in Village ME. And then in August, there was a lot of word on the street, articles saying that they were exploring options to divest its stake. I mean, this is amazing, like multi-billion-dollar company. And, in this whole direction of being able to provide primary care, this company's going to zero. I don't know. What does it say? Is it possible to create a business out of primary care?
I don't know. I mean, I will say I've been very skeptical. Zeke Emanuel talked about this in one of his books a number of years ago and touted the fact that this can be profitable. But the one observation I've made is that the only places we've seen them be profitable is sort of the Medicare Advantage space, for which there's a lot of financial hanky-panky that goes on, and I'm not certain it's real, although I have friends in that business. We've interviewed some of them who are convinced, so I don't want to take it away, but I worry about it. And then there's the rich people component. I think One Medical Iora working within Amazon, like if you're a wealthy person and you want to pay a subscription to be able to access immediate telemedicine consultations and be able to pay those costs as they come, that's probably profitable as well. But, a huge percent, it's not a majority, but it's a large plurality of primary care right now, is delivered to the poorest people in the country through our community health centers nationwide.
Yeah. I can tell you, by the way, Iora didn't start wanting to cater to better off people. It wanted to create greater access. Yeah. The last point I'll make about this, which is I think important, is that many of these models were about this value-based care, that these groups were going to go at risk. They were going to say, we're going to cover a certain number of people. We're going to take care of them, and we'll do it for a certain cost. This capitated model, value-based model. And seemingly they have not been able to make it work. And I think for people listening, some people may be using some of these services. The question will be their sustainability.
No, it genuinely worries me because I do think we've always had a 2 or a 3-tiered system, but all of this movement that's going on seems to only convince me more and more that there'll be tiers, and that if you're in the lower third of the population, maybe lower half of the population, you're mostly relegated to community health centers and so on. If you're in the large middle class, let's say, you're going to struggle to find good primary care, and you're going to resolve mostly to see specialists in lieu of primary care providers.
Well, and let's be honest, in most major medical centers, the primary care are a loss leader. They're bringing people in who end up, when they have more expensive tests and procedures, end up creating margin for the systems. And when somebody tries to peel that off, we've seen before that people were peeling off high margin areas, orthopedic surgery, areas that were high margin. And so that was what the arbitrage opportunity was. Let's peel off high margin. But primary care was never a high margin business.
No.
And
but One Medical peels off the high margin.
The high margin of
that business.
Of that business, yeah. Okay, what else we got?
So also good news, although again, may start off sounding like bad news, but I think most of our listeners are aware right now that there was an outbreak of E. coli, of a highly infectious, lethal type of E. coli, 0157H7, 13 states, 90 people, 1 person died, all seemingly related to a McDonald's Quarter Pounders, I think. The cases started in late September, they peaked in early October, and they seem to have waned. And we only know the numbers I just gave you are tip of the iceberg, because we know a lot more people got it, but they just didn't have a severe disease from it. And by the way, tens of thousands of people get this every year, so this is not, this is just one outbreak. But it's just a good example of how CDC swoops in, is able to work with local authorities, state authorities, and the McDonald's to identify the cause for these connected cases. They eventually figured out it was the slivered onions on the
oh my God.
On the Quarter Pounders. They stopped the company that was providing the slivered onions to McDonald's from distributing it to anybody for a time being while they continue to investigate. They've proven that the patties themselves are safe. Big Macs.
It was one store? Or
one company.
One company. How many stores?
According to this, it's 13 states.
13 states. Wow, that was bigger than I hadn't been paying a lot of attention to this.
Yeah,
wow, that's
slivered onions. And who knew? I didn't even realize slivered onions were uncooked. And that's part of the problem, because E. coli outbreaks are more often than not raw foods, not.
And did you say, and what happened to people who ate it?
1 person died. 2 people with hemolytic uremic syndrome, which, as you know, is a near lethal.
It's a devastating disease.
And 24 more were hospitalized over that.
So that's a big deal.
It is a big deal. And I want to, for our listeners, 2 other things. The 2 most recent E. coli outbreaks of substance, organic walnuts and raw cheddar cheese. And it just reminds me, because we've talked about raw milk and the risks of raw milk, like, be careful what you're buying out there when you're talking about raw milk in particular, or products made from raw milk. Raw cheddar cheese is a product from raw milk. And while we're not talking about H5N1 here, we are concerned that you could get E. coli more likely from raw cheddar cheese than you could from anything else.
Well, that's fascinating. All right, I got one more here to end on.
Yep.
So there was a very interesting paper that appeared in the Harvard Business Review, that focused on how startups survive, let alone thrive in this world of AI. And it was sort of posing this question: is this a moment where there will be a Google? I mean, we have OpenAI, for example, that's big, but is this a massive opportunity for startups? What will happen in this? And they were sort of making the case that for a lot of these early stage companies, what they really need to do is find these strategic partnerships. That as they want to go to transformation, the real key here is going to be the power of data and compute resources. And I would say also distribution channels. And it's hard for something starting brand new to be able to have the wherewithal to either get the capital nowadays. I mean, it's not as easy as just starting in the garage and, having a good algorithm and getting moving, but that this is going to be about being able to pair. And then then the article goes into saying there are really going to be a lot of opportunities here in service provision, that startups can add value by offering AI-driven services. And so they're really taking that foundational models or the foundational resources and then translating them into something that becomes to have value. So this model requires startups to think about and end user services that can potentially lead to capturing a sort of a more extensive market share. And I think it's also that there are going to be increasing questions about what is responsible use of this AI. So any company that kind of goes into this is also, it's not the Wild West. It is still the Wild West, but it's increasingly going to have oversight and concern. So again, why these strategic partnerships for anyone who wants to get into this. So it's a gold rush in some ways, but in other ways, again, with the need for data, the need for compute resources, and the distribution channels, it's a question of who's going to be able to find the slipstream to be able to get traction.
You worry in a world where the biggest tech companies are now trillion-dollar or multi-trillion-dollar valuations. And by that, I'm talking about, Meta, Google, Apple, Microsoft, thank you, and NVIDIA, but put that aside. But they're such big companies at this point that they can dominate this space. They can monopolize access to capital in many ways. They can jumpstart almost anything they want.
And look at Apple. They have the hardware. They have the network. They have the distribution channels. I mean,
they can do it all if they want.
It's an immense advantage.
Absolutely. And they collect the data in ways that other companies like, Google can, and Meta can, but not NVIDIA can. And so I wonder about how that is anti-competitive. People do talk about, when you're too big to compete on the same level as these other companies. I'll just give you one thing along those lines. Elon Musk put out a prompt for his followers or for anybody on Twitter X to submit X-rays and CAT scans into his AI model, which is called Grok, G-R-O-K.
Yeah, Grok, yeah.
And asking them to test this.
Grok has special meaning in the computer science.
I don't even know.
If you grok something, you really kind of try to...
It's good?
You understand it.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, I didn't know what it meant. But the point is, he's putting all of this into this now. And I wonder, he's not as rigorous as others would be about saying, hey, let's make sure there's no patient data on this. Let's make sure you're being
people give it to him. It's,
And that's what they're doing. So people are, just because of the power of this one man, are feeding information into this system. He has a comparative advantage as well.
He does. Indeed, he does.
Yes.
Indeed, he does.
Yep.
You've been listening to Health and Veritas with Harlan Krumos Haifo. Howie, this is a lot of fun. I'm so glad to have the opportunity to talk with you.
I really do. And I hope our listeners appreciate it. I hope they'll give us feedback about this episode, about all of our episodes. And by the way, we really, as we've proven, we really will respond to your questions, whether you put them on a review, whether you put them on a reply on social media, or whether you send it to us at health.veritas@yale.edu.
Yeah. And so for folks listening, we're sponsored by the Yale School of Management and the Yale School of Public Health. We're assisted in amazing ways by our producer, Miranda Schaefer, and by our student researchers and supporters, Sophia Stumpf, Ines Gil, Tobias Liu. And, so Howie, we're finishing here before the election. Let's just at least have a wish for a smooth, peaceful election day and that we get a rapid result and that's
it.
We can coalesce as a country. I mean, this sounds like a dream, but
no, I agree with you.
When this drops,
I hope that by the time people listening to this episode that there is a peaceful path ahead for all of us.
Yep, for sure. Thank you, Howie.
Thanks a lot, Harlan.
Talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon.